The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ben Page. I'm the Chief Executive of Ipsos Mori, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar on climate change and the coronavirus, and perhaps what we can learn from how quickly and dramatically the world has responded to the coronavirus, and indeed what that might mean for a much greater challenge in some ways, which of course is climate change. We're going to have a presentation now from my colleague Jess Long, who leads the Green Economy group at Ipsos Mori, bringing together our work on energy, on waste, on packaging, on public attitudes, and on the whole gamut of issues around climate change and carbon. And then at the end, we will have time for questions. Do post questions if the app is letting you. I think it does. And of course, we will also send you all copies of the slides, so you don't need to write down anything. But hopefully this will be an interesting discussion, because this issue is going to be with us, hopefully, hopefully or unhopefully, this issue will be with us for much longer than the coronavirus. Jess, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. I also want to say that we're also recording this session as well. So for those of individuals that can't make it, we can send that through. Equally, if you find some stuff that we say today quite compelling and you would like us to present, just get in touch with me afterward. Happy to arrange a time to present to you and your stakeholders. I also want to do a quick thank you to Lizzie Gordon and Ruth Townend, who have co-authored the corresponding paper that is the basis for this webinar as well. And they've been really instrumental in helping put everything together. So to start off, I really want us to think back to 2019. And I know that feels like ages ago at this point, but really only a few months ago when you actually think of it in the grand scheme of things. The 2019 was actually the year of climate change. And our global trends survey actually found, it was a massive survey across 33 different countries, found that the single core value that united the world was actually our concern for climate change. And actually 4 in 5 people thought we were headed for on a global level, thought we were headed for an environmental disaster. And just depending on which side of the fence you sit, you could actually see or even make the argument that COVID-19 has been that environmental disaster. And in the months leading up to COVID-19, we actually see Greta Thunberg being the face of the movement, more or less, rising in popularity beyond Beyonce. This is UK Google search results, and we're seeing sudden spikes and increases in popularity. And even the term Thunberging has actually become a thing, with more younger people using the words climate change in their dating profiles 240% more than the year before. So it's definitely becoming an on-trend movement, particularly with the younger generation. And it's not surprising, however, that concern about climate change as one of the most important issues that faces Britain today drops when we have other major news events like a new prime minister or Brexit coming in, and then spikes when we have environmental issues like widespread flooding or massive storms. But what I want to draw your attention to is actually in the last couple of years, we've seen a staggering increase in climate change concern. But where this drops off is, unsurprisingly, when COVID-19 hits, it plummets, right? So one of the questions that we're getting from our industry clients and from our public sector clients is, well, is this still a concern for people? Is climate change even on the public's mind at all? And the fact is, it's still seen as a huge issue. We've recently done some polling as late as end of May, and that found that 4 in 5 people globally say climate change issues pose a serious threat to our health and well-being today. So even in the midst of a pandemic, 4 in 5 people globally can acknowledge the link between climate change and their health and well-being. We also see that 71% of people feel climate change is just as important of an issue as COVID-19 in the long term. And 55% in the UK disagree that protecting the environment right now is a low priority. So very much still a huge issue. So we can anticipate, well, if it's such a huge issue, we should be seeing really strong behavioral shifts and changes amongst the public that correspond with these attitudes. And the reality is, unfortunately, we haven't. While intention to and willingness to try to do more environmental behavior stays relatively high, with things like not flying and recycling materials or walking or cycling more, saving energy at home, those figures really haven't changed much on a global level in the last 6 years. And you might be asking, well, why? Why is that? And what we are seeing is that the public is really demanding that the government and industry play a bigger role in leadership here in getting things across the line. And that's quite evident in our recent polling around, and again, this is from late May, should your government make environmental protection a priority in recovering from COVID-19? And we have 71% in the UK say, yes, it should be. And which is significantly high. So there's a massive support for the government and for industry to really step up in this space and prioritize the environment post-COVID-19. Where it gets a little bit tricky is when it comes to the fact that we are on the brink of a massive economic recession, probably the biggest in any of our lifetimes. And you know, should the government focus on helping the economy to recover, even if that means taking actions that are bad for the environment? Here we see 46% of people in the UK agree with that versus 43% of people. So this is where the UK is a bit more split as there's concern about an economic recovery. But to highlight, those don't necessarily have to sit in juxtaposition to each other, although that's can be a concern for some people. But it would be remiss if we don't acknowledge the fact that a crisis does not happen in a silo. We are living within a crisis, within a crisis, within a crisis, within a crisis right now. We have, as I mentioned, a looming economic recession. We have the Black Lives Matter movement. We have post-COVID-19, or some of us are still living the realities of that quite strongly across the globe. And we have climate change as well. And we need to stop looking at these things as happening in a silo. Actually, there's a lot of intersection across all of them, and they all touch upon each other in different ways. And that was actually the impetus of this report, and actually going into this white paper is quite early on, we saw the world coming together to actually affect change. And we thought, well, what can we learn from COVID-19 that might be applicable to the climate change movement more broadly? But we need to also acknowledge that climate change is a quite unique issue when it comes to some of the other issues that I've just mentioned. And I'm going to highlight what the different factors that impede action and kind of make this a little bit more tricky. Number one, as I mentioned before, is we're looming on an economic recession, the worst potentially in 300 years. And as I've mentioned as well, there can be some tension between people thinking of a slow green start versus the rapid recovery. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, and we'll get to that in a little bit later, but that is one key challenge, is how do we actually get people to look at a green recovery as a way that's also a long-term and a short-term economic strategy. The issue of climate change is also nonlinear and complex. It's a really nebulous issue. It's quite challenging to identify impact. We call global warming, and then we've changed that language because some parts of the world are actually getting colder. So it's very difficult to highlight a cause and effect relationship and therefore demonstrate impact and milestones when things are nonlinear. And it's therefore difficult to get the public on board, as well as to prioritize amongst the government and amongst industry as well. It's also not seen as media a threat. Arguably, COVID-19, Black Lives Matter movement, those are life and death issues. And those, not to say that climate change isn't being felt like that in some areas of the world right now, and not to say that it won't become that, but it's not seen as that. When we speak to experts, they still say, well, we have about 10 years or so, we have about a decade to solve climate change. So this ends up taking a back seat sometimes when we're talking about other issues. Another key challenge is that the impacts of climate change are felt differently across the globe. So depending on what country, and we have statistics on this as well, but depending on what country you might sit in, you might prioritize flooding or deforestation, or in the case of the UK, waste management is a massive issue here. But at the same time, in order to solve some of these issues, we need to come together and learn how to work on a global level as well. And then within our GTS report, our global trends survey that I mentioned before, we also did find a significant number of people, although a minority, but also still significant, 37% of people that are sick of the fuss about environmentalism. And it's really these people that industry and government are really wary of, because they really don't want to be seen as employing a zealot approach. And I don't know how many of you have seen that BBC article floating around, I think it was BBC, that mentioned MPs are not acting on climate change because they're worried about being seen as a zealot. And really we need to transition away from that thinking because the vast majority of people do support action here. So I want to introduce some analogous learnings from COVID-19 that are applicable to the climate change movement and agenda. Number one is listening to the experts. Number two is preventative measures are key. Number three is we need to come together, social cohesion required to protect the vulnerable. Number four is government and industry absolutely must help lead the way. And number five is in leading the way, and in order to get the public on board, we need to have clear, tangible communications and asks. So when we talk about listening to the experts, some of you might be familiar with that TED Talk that Bill Gates did about 5 years ago, basically warning the world that we are at high risk of a global pandemic. We are vastly unprepared to actually do anything about it. And what came of that? Not a lot, because it's resurfaced in popularity now 5 years later. At the same time, climate experts have been warning about the impacts of climate change for decades now, and that is a massive concern. But really what we need to have here is a return to listening to the experts and really heralding the science and the data behind these points. When we think about COVID-19, we had Chris Finney here, who really has been the face of the science and the data behind COVID-19, the strategy behind it. What we need as well is we need to have an expert face of climate change in the UK. And some of you might argue, well, we have Greta Thunberg, we have David Attenborough. Yes, we do, but we're talking about an actual science background where they can begin to help us prioritize what to focus on, how do we measure impact, and how do we take, as I mentioned before, quite a nebulous issue and highlight key tangible asks to move forward. Preventative measures are key, number two. So we have 2 in 3 Britons actually feel that the UK government acted too late in implementing stricter lockdown measures. And we see quite similar sentiments when we look at climate change as well. So 7 in 10 Britons say if their government doesn't act on climate change now, it will be failing its people. So it's quite a significant figure there. And if we were to tell the UK government, 6 months ago that they would be paying 8.7 million people's furloughs for their job wages, they probably would have laughed and said, absolutely no way. So we need to really highlight the fact that preventative measures and having a resilient economy as we move forward is absolutely key. And one way we do this is by stop focusing on the nudges, stop focusing on the behavioral change aspects of the public, and instead focus on the levers to engage. Government has a mandate to do this. You look at the congestion zone and the congestion charge that we have in the UK and London. There's no vote on that, and that has been widely accepted and been widely successful in reducing emissions as well. And also, from reflecting on COVID-19, I just read an article this morning that had said, actually, if we had entered lockdown a week earlier, we would have halved the number of deaths potentially for COVID-19. So really, it's all about prevention. And in that case, when it comes to climate change, that means acting now, not waiting till 9 years from now. Another interesting one is about protecting the most vulnerable. And when we think about the face of vulnerability and those at risk in COVID-19, it was really the elderly and those that had or underlying health conditions. And it was really pressure on the young people who weren't considered as vulnerable, who might be going out and not complying with social distancing measures, and what they needed to do to help to come together to protect the vulnerable and the marginalized. We see that flipped on its head almost exactly when it comes to climate change. So with the younger generation, we see them saying, we are the most vulnerable. We are the ones that are going to be on the planet long enough to see some of the negative aspects of climate change play out. And it's really kind of looking to the older generations to help join the movement and to lead and to, in some respects, compensate for some of the mistakes that have been made in previous generations. And they're not saying that these generational divides are things that we need to focus on by any means. We need to acknowledge that, COVID-19 was not the great equalizer, neither is climate change. And there will be people that feel the impacts of climate change very differently. and we need to come together, just like we did with COVID-19, to work together to prioritize these people as well. Government industry must absolutely lead the way. So we have, 57% of people globally saying they would be put on voting for a political party whose policies don't deal seriously with climate change. That's a pretty significant number, as is globally 68% that say their government would be failing them if it doesn't act now to combat climate change. Slightly higher in the UK at 71%, but 68% globally. So industry and government have a huge opportunity here. And we need to think about not just leading with the carrot rather than the stick. So this is a massive opportunity here. So number one is the new green job growth, focusing on that. And just read a statistic today, or I read an article rather today that said that home insulation can provide lots of new green jobs. And faster than road infrastructure jobs in the UK if we were to prioritize that moving forward in a green recovery. Number two is a long-term economic plan. We can't just think about a short-term rapid economic growth, to try to stave off an economic recession if that means that we are going to still be more vulnerable to things like this happening down the line. So you really need to think about a long-term resilient strategy, as I've mentioned before. And this is also a massive opportunity to increase public closeness, for government at the polls, particularly relevant, as I've just mentioned with these statistics, but also with industry as well. This is a huge opportunity to really pave the way, find your niche, and to really increase consumer closeness at the heart of things. But how do they do that? Well, when we look at what has worked, clear, tangible communications are absolutely needed. So if we look at for COVID-19, 90% of people in the UK felt that the government's communications were clear or fairly clear from lockdown. Where that gets more nuanced is that the more it gets nuanced, it gets 56% of people begin to feel like actually, yeah, they're clear or fairly clear, but we see that massively tail dive. Now, why is that? There's a couple of different reasons. Obviously, more nuanced message apply the further we get embedded into this crisis. But at the same time, we need to highlight the fact that a nuanced message puts the onus of responsibility on the public to calculate the risk. Yeah. So now all of a sudden, rather than going out and saying, you have to social distance, all these things, now we're talking about, okay, well, sending your children back to school, or maybe we're going to lift the measures on social distancing, or now we're having this new bubble discussion. So it's really getting a lot more convoluted. And when it comes to climate change, nuanced messages won't work because the public can't wrap their head around calculating the risks of, again, such a vast topic and issue. So it becomes quite a challenge here. However, it is still possible. With clear, tangible communications have proven to work where you take an issue like climate change and you break it down. For example, the plastic bag tax as well. So we need to begin to think about what is the three-word equivalent, or what is the catchphrase for climate change? And do we need to break it down into different aspects and different ways to begin to wrap our head around what the next step is and to get public compliance in terms of moving them along? So one thing that COVID-19 has taught us is that on a global level, on a national level, and on a local level, when we feel that there is a clear and present danger, we can align to act quickly and effectively, which is very promising. But at the same time, without quick and decisive leadership, a carbon rebound is inevitable. So obviously, 2008, 2009, we saw carbon emissions drop as well, not as significantly, but they still dropped. 2010 skyrocketed through the roof again. We're already seeing that happen in China as well, unfortunately. So China's now back to carbon emissions that were pre-COVID levels. So we need to begin to think about, how do we shape the new normal? We're living in a completely, arguably one of the biggest forced behavioral change experiments ever, and in so doing, this is likely to have an impact on our attitudes and our behaviors and the way we interact with different brands and products as well. So how do we take some of these tensions that have emerged or are beginning to emerge out of COVID-19, and as we begin to exit COVID-19, into an opportunity? I want to talk to you about 6 key industries today. Now, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. These are just industries that we've identified as having key tensions and some key opportunities as well. And these industries are automotive and transport, energy and utilities, fashion and retail, finance, food and drink, and travel and leisure. So automotive and transport is getting a lot of attention in the news right now. Many governments are rethinking their infrastructure and how they can actually get people to reduce their car use as well. As we begin to return back to work for some of us, the big question is, if we can't take public transport, will we be more likely to take our private vehicles if we have them? And 2 in 3 globally say they will plan to use their private vehicle. And obviously, if you're given the choice between prioritizing your immediate health and risking exposure in a confined, crowded setting versus your potential reduction in long-term impact of environmental impact, then obviously you're going to choose the short-term impact. It's quite an obvious one here. So we see countries like Italy, we see in Germany coming forward with new plans on cycling, extended and expanded cycling pathways, and new widened pavements as well for pedestrians. And to what extent will that be relevant for London? Well, we know that 69% of Londoners actually support widening of pavements, and 64% of Londoners support temporary provisions of cycle routes as well. So really, however, this is a massive opportunity, but there's a small window in terms of when we can enact this change. And so this is a really urgent opportunity here to be addressed. Energy and utilities is a really interesting one. I mentioned that statistic earlier, or that finding earlier, about home insulation being a potential area as well to create new job growth, to help people in the public to save money on the brink of a recession, and also to transition into more greener economy as well. So there is an economic imperative to this one that's quite interesting. When we ask people if they're willing to limit their contribution to climate change by saving energy at home in the next year, globally, 50% of people said yes. And the findings in the UK are relevant to that as well. 49% said that they would be willing to save energy at home or save water at home as well. But they really need an opportunity to begin to address their resource efficiency, perhaps with speaking to other needs, such as economic interests at this current time. Now, fashion and retail is a really interesting one because they've taken a massive hit. And I don't know if you're in the same camp as me, but I've been attending most of my Zoom meetings, dressed nicely from the top up and then wearing pajama bottoms from down below. So, you know, that's obviously not going into the office every day, not the increased opportunity for some of us to work from home means that our relationship with fashion and retail might change significantly. Now, what we already saw in 2018 and 2019, and even the beginning of 2020, is that the trend of ending fast fashion was very, very high. And we're seeing now behaviors being just only supporting the fact that the end of fast fashion will likely continue. 52% globally are avoiding buying new goods, mending what they have, or buying used products. And the awareness, however, in this space in terms of who is sustainable and who is not, and what qualifies as fast fashion and what doesn't, is quite muddled. And so there's a massive opportunity here for big fashion players to begin to position themselves as being more sustainable clothing lines or fashion lines. And a great example of this is Patagonia, the outdoor clothing brand. And they came up a few years ago, I don't know if any of you guys remember, but they came up with a "Don't Buy This Jacket" campaign where they featured their new jackets and they had images of them and they literally said, "Don't buy this," in an attempt to reduce excess consumption. And it was such a popular campaign that they saw an increase of sales by 50%. So obviously, environmentally, the impact wasn't great. They've done other amazing campaigns as well that have had a positive environmental impact, but they had a huge reception in terms of the efforts that they were making, and their customer base was very, very supportive of that. So we will likely see, again, with an economic recession and the rise of vintage, a likelihood in terms of growing trend for long-term stable investment pieces as well. Financial services is another interesting one. You know, Ipsos has done a lot of stuff. They kind of led the way in open banking research here in the UK that is rolled out to different regulators across the globe. But COVID-19 has really helped push more people into that digital banking, online banking space. We see 3 in 4 people say coronavirus will have a high financial impact on them. Personally, that's probably not to say surprising, but what's really quite interesting is that SMEs are really A, quite vulnerable, and B, growing and increasing in their in concern over their financial habits. So, you know, we talked to people that were personal instructors and yoga instructors, and they were used to going into different studios, and that was they went from employee and then realized on COVID-19 with lockdown that actually they could do a lot of what they were doing previously by cutting out the middleman and essentially doing everything online via Zoom. So we have Jenny here saying, I've become a business owner overnight, and she's now using platforms like PayPal to basically run her own business and directly deal with her customers. It's also an estimation that banks and fintechs will likely have to work together to begin to improve their offering, their digital offering that was previously wasn't necessarily as user-friendly or wasn't fit for purpose. And there's been a lot of kind of competition between them historically, but this is a real big opportunity for them to work together. Food and drink. Now, this is quite an interesting one as well. Plastic pollution versus protection is a huge ongoing challenge that we have. So you might have seen that, you know, the focus on plastic as a more hygienic option. There's a massive trade-off between that and the concern, particularly within the UK, as I've mentioned before, with excess waste and excess packaging. And which is, again, one of the top 3 environmental concerns in Britain. And so there's a bit of a tension point in terms of how this plays out. So food and drink is actually quite a challenging one because it has quite a lot of tension. It's quite a confusing area as well for consumers to navigate if they're trying to do environmental good. And I'm going to highlight that by talking to you about a cucumber, a meal kit, and some organic food, and what those 3 actually have in common. In 2018, retail grocery store Morrison's decided to get rid of some of their plastic packaging in an attempt to appeal to their consumer base as well, and also limit their environmental impact. And they got rid of all the plastic around their cucumbers. But the moment you do that, you increase the likelihood of spoilage for these cucumbers, which then it increases your carbon footprint and basically outweighs any potential environmental positivity around reducing plastic around the cucumbers. So it's actually more environmentally friendly to keep plastic around your cucumbers than to remove them given spoilage. So again, not a very straightforward issue. We did see a massive uptake in meal kits as well. And meal kits, while they have a lot of excess packaging as well, they tend to have a lower carbon footprint, according to some findings from the University of Michigan. So the attention here is, okay, well, is there a way to now provide meal kits with more sustainable packaging solutions? And another challenge here is organic food. You know, we're taught, well, if you buy organic, it's less pesticides, it's more healthy for you, it's more healthy for the environment, but actually it also has a higher carbon footprint sometimes because there's a risk of more spoilage and the products aren't necessarily ready to sale and appropriate to sale because they might not be in as good of condition. This is further exacerbated by quite confusing messages from government and industry as well. So we've had a massive success and support for the straw ban that was meant to happen. It was a ban ban on plastic straws, cotton buds, and plastic stirs that was meant to happen in April. That's actually been postponed to October. So what are we communicating to the public if we're saying, you know, well, this can wait a few months, let's push it back. The other challenge is, in some cases, particularly in the US, they've repealed bans on plastic bags. So in California, there was massive support for banning plastic bags, or even in some cases the tax on plastic bags, but that has been at times revoked because it was seen that reusable bags were actually potentially less hygienic in COVID-19 than single-use plastic carrier bags. And although the science and the data suggests that actually the virus is more likely to live on harder surfaces like plastic than fabric, that still is a very confusing message in terms of what you're telling the consumer base. But when it comes to all of this, fundamentally, the public doesn't think that they alone should be the ones that have to bear the burden of excess packaging and more sustainable footprints. It's really about sharing that effort equally across retailers, across manufacturers, across governments, and across consumers themselves. So 40% of people feel like it should be shared equally, compared to 9% of consumers who feel like that should be just on consumers alone. Now, travel and leisure is obviously one of the hardest hit industries. This one's really tricky because the trade-off here can be really challenging for consumers. On the one hand, if you are a vegan for 2 years, that can be immediately offset if you take a long-haul flight. And so people are catching on to this, but if you've been in lockdown for 3 or 4 months and you're looking to try to get out and experience the world shortly after this, we don't really know what that's going to look like, if people are going to just hop on planes and head to somewhere sunny to try to get away once this lifts. We have kind of mixed statistics that are coming out. So on the one hand, we have 41% of people, and this was taken in the kind of lead up into COVID-19, but 41% of people globally say they are likely to avoid flying in the next year to limit their personal contribution to climate change, versus 31% who said they would not, versus 59% who say globally they will go back to doing all things they did before the crisis, including travel. So again, we don't really quite know what's going to happen in this space, but I do want to draw your attention to quite an interesting trend that's emerging, which is, and I'm not going to even attempt to say this word, but this is a Scandinavian word that translates to flight shame. And we're seeing trends like that happen in the UK, particularly at a qualitative level as well. There's a lot of green guilt, particularly among the quote unquote woke younger generations, about unnecessary travel and your carbon footprint for taking that flight to the Maldives. Now, 5 to 10 years ago, very trendy to show yourself traveling around the world on your social media profiles and exotic locations. Now there's a lot of green guilt that is beginning to emerge of, yeah, but did you really need to go to that place? So it's an interesting one to watch. And I will say as well that people are doing some really interesting stuff. Sarah Wilkins, who is a former Ipsos colleague who is founder of Fly Green Alliance, is doing really interesting stuff in this space, which is a consultancy group that works on sustainable travel sector as well. So keeping an eye on things that people are doing to try to transform this industry so we can still travel and explore the world, but do it in a more eco-friendly way. And just to sum up, we can't return to normal. Normal wasn't working. This is the mantra of the Black Lives Matter movement. This is the mantra of COVID-19. This is also the mantra of climate change. We need to begin to think about how we can evolve and how we can move forward. And we really anticipate that we're only going to see increased conversations on a green recovery and what that will look like. But it's really up to government and industry and the people on this call to actually affect change and to actually work swiftly to make this happen. So I'll leave you with some summary points here. Number one is we need to acknowledge that no crisis occurs in a silo. And I've said that before, but we need to stop thinking about, well, climate change can wait while other things are going on, because really there will always be something else going on. And it's okay, and it is possible to appeal to more than one need state. I talked about the utilities before, and how we can potentially appeal to the economic interests of the public as we go into a recession. Talking about health, again, people are making those organic linkages between their health and climate change, even in the middle of a pandemic. How do we speak to that a bit more? How do we come together to protect the vulnerable, or people that are going to feel this, the impacts of climate change more significantly than others? And off the back of that really is that we need to stress that this is about growing the green economy and growth generally, not restricting growth. Long gone are the days of viewing green as kind of these fringe things where there is no economic growth or advantage in doing that. We can have a green recovery, and we can prioritize the economy at the same time. We need to do it carefully, and we need to really consider how we grow the economy specifically. So this isn't a nice to have CSR initiative, but there's economics and a long-term strategy embedded. Number 3 is we need to break down a really complex issue. Government and industry should give the public clear, tangible actions that make a difference. You know, and for those of you on the call that are coming from an industry perspective, you don't need to be all things to all people. It is possible, and this is going to be an incredibly competitive space depending on the industry sector that you sit in, for people to find what their brand positioning is and to really find their niche and own it. Transparency is going to be key. How you communicate this in a clear and tangible way is going to be key. And then finally, for government particularly, you know, nudges alone won't work. We need to stop putting all the pressure and all the expectations on the public to basically do this for you. They've given you the mandate to do stuff. They've given you the mandate to move forward. So how can we employ levers to enact change in the public, much like the congestion zone example that I gave earlier, where there wasn't a vote on this, but it still had some massive successful implications as a result. And just to sum up in entirety, I mean, coming out of COVID-19, obviously a very traumatic event has occurred for the world, and we're still dealing with that. But what has come out is that we can work together, that we can address quick and effective change. We can do it on a global level, we can do it on a national level, and we can do it on a local level. And that gives us a promising start to how we can actually implement some of these same types of lessons learned as we move forward into resolving the next crisis ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jess. Thank you. We've got a number of questions that have come in. So let's, we've got some really interesting people on the call. I wish I could create a marvelous screen with everybody's cameras on the call, but with 100+ people listening in, we're not going to be able to do that. But we do have, we know people from government, we have activists and charities and NGOs, and we have, of course, major energy companies and major banks. So it's an interesting group of people, and that's sort of reflected in the questions. So we've got 3 questions, so let's just perhaps look at those to start with. So the first is that one thing that's happened partly as a result of the COVID-19 epidemic is the postponement of the of COP26 in Glasgow, which was going to be, to me, when I started the year, of course, and I saw the data that we've discussed in this presentation, I thought was going to be a huge thing and maybe see a sort of bit of sea change or a big moment in 2020. So what's going to replace COP26? Let's think about that. There's a question about the data. I think we've said that a lot of this is during the pandemic, so we think that people are taking on board their concerns, but we've, as I've said, all of the data in the presentation, we can give you the fieldwork dates. There was a political advisor just asking about that. And then the other question is, we've talked about financial services and some of the impact in terms of the consumer usage there. But what about, of course, asset owners who are making investments? And they're surely, somebody's saying, I think it's Matt at the Phoenix Group, how important a role do asset owners like life insurers and pension schemes have in all this? So, Jess, do you want to reflect on those for a second?
Yeah. They're really good questions. In terms of starting with COP26 and what will replace this, I don't think, to my knowledge, and again, I don't know, Sven, if you have any thoughts about this as well, I don't know if this is something that needs to be replaced so much as there's going to be a lot of pressure come October come the months beyond October and moving forward in terms of catching up on the metrics and making sure that everyone's being compliant. And to what extent do we, I don't think it's about a matter of replacing COP26. I think it's a matter of how do we make sure that we're going to have to make up that time once the event comes forward in 2021. It's such a hard question to answer. I don't know, Ben, do you have any comments?
Yeah. Well, my only, I think, I mean, the question for if you're a green activist or you're trying to push the dial, I mean, we've seen in the digital space us achieve more in terms of digital adoption in the last 2 months than we had done in previous years. So as we come out of, as we go into what appears to be a pretty bleak recession, as you point out, Jess, and as we see unemployment rising, the government is going to be under huge pressure to do something different. It probably isn't going to, most governments don't look as though they're going to try and adopt the austerity programs that were the response along with quantitative easing to the 2008 crash and recession. And so rather you're looking at, obviously many of us on this call would be interested to see what can we do to promote green infrastructure, green energy. We've seen the stimulus plan announced for Germany, big subsidies for electric cars, etc. The British government is sort of saying, well, we need to wait and see. But I guess if you're a green activist, you're pushing for those, you will want to be demonstrating those shovel-ready schemes or the switches that we can make that will help employment, will help investment, will encourage investment, and ultimately will stimulate low carbon alternatives, I think. I mean, so, but I haven't seen a sort of coherent, and somebody on this call will now correct me, of course, that this sort of coherent program coming forward, and maybe government is cooking it up as we speak. But you know, one thing that I've been very struck by in the last year or so is just the success that Britain has had, top, I think, amongst all of the OECD countries, and in terms of renewables. You know, we've in energy, we've done brilliantly in terms of wind, etc., without the consumers having to make very large sacrifices. And the question is, what are those other schemes, particularly if a government is going to be able to run, looks likely to be running large deficits? You know, it's going to spend more than it's receiving in income for all sorts of reasons. And indeed, the global markets at the moment appear to be willing to put up with that. They're, you know, negative interest rates, and many people still want to lend Britain money. It's borrowing, the government's borrowing far more money than it did in the aftermath of the 2008, immediate aftermath of the 2008 crash. And yet there seems to be plenty of appetite at the moment for that debt. So how do, you know, what does government do that? I don't know if anybody is going to immediately tell us the answer. But on you know, what about sort of small businesses? You know, do we when we talk about industry, I guess, do you think people are thinking about small? Another question is, do we think people are thinking about small businesses or larger businesses? What do you think, Jess?
Well, I think there's a massive opportunity to engage with SMEs. I think what's come out of this is definitely a rise in SMEs more broadly. As I mentioned before, you have people that are going at this on their own, and also there's a lot of people that are really struggling right now to make things to make it through this period and actually survive. We've also seen a lot of people going under during this time. So this is a huge opportunity for engagement and to understand what their needs are as well. I think, and as I mentioned before, that digital solutions around this as well is really a massive opportunity. How the current big financial players can engage better with the fintechs to really reconsider what their offering has been before, and assume that this is the way. I mean, it's been a slight justification of how do we, you know, to what degree will people adopt open banking? To what degree are people moving forward down that digital path? It's now becoming inevitable that we need to move down that way, even more so for SMEs. And partnering with fintechs really feels like a viable opportunity to improve a model that was previously no longer fit for purpose. And then go on. No, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think the question from Anne Stevenson at Cardiff University is, you know, when the public talk about industry, do they mean, given that the vast majority of businesses in this country, of course, employ 10 people or less, and there's only 8,000 businesses that are actually large employers. When the public talks about industry, you know, my view, for what it's worth, is that they think of huge businesses rather than actually the reality of businesses being quote unquote ordinary people employing not very many people. Okay, we've got, I think the question about green investment and the investment industry itself controlling vast, huge assets, directing and starting to become much more choosy about what business is doing because it doesn't want to invest pension money, our collective money, into things that will catch fire, flood, or be underwater in a few years' time, and also, is concerned about ESG goals. What's your take on that, Jess? Because I know you're already also involved in financial services work as well.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of research in the space at the moment, and this is definitely an area in terms of green investments that we're exploring. We're seeing fossil fuels plummet and going into negative figures, and so we are seeing that that the ESG space is rising in popularity and demand, particularly, and this does seem to be a really promising area that the trend is only going to continue to grow. I think what's really surprising people is how much this has become almost overnight. Back when we started this paper, there was very few people talking about climate change in relation to COVID-19. It was actually considered quite taboo. But the public began to make organic associations, and sometimes quite controversially so, organic associations with what's going on. And this has actually seen a massive rise in terms of dialogue around green investments, dialogue around ESG, dialogue around what we need to do, and the public more at large in terms of an interest in green finance. So the anticipation is that this is a definite area for an opportunity, definitely going to continue to grow. But we're still doing research in the space, so it's a tricky one.
Okay, so we've got another question here from Robin Webster at Climate Outreach, who's pointing out, I think as we've shown, that concern about climate change will undoubtedly fall when people have short-term, near-term, deadly problems like COVID-19. I guess, I probably tend to agree with Robin about that, it's difficult when people are obsessed about keeping their job or a deadly disease that might kill them in 2 weeks' time to keep the same level of concern about climate change. What's your sort of take on that, Jess?
Well, I think it goes back to that idea before of no crisis happens in a silo. I've said it a few times already, and we have to stop thinking about it as that. Because if we continue to do that, in 9 years' time, we're going to be at a point where this isn't no longer a long-term, faraway threat. This is something immediate. This is an immediate crisis, and there is going to continue to be challenges. I mean, I just shared an article with my team from the New York Times on racism and climate change, and addressing that issue. I've also looked at, obviously the green recovery talks about how we can have a more economic imperative and not just, and how we loop that into green job growth and talking about in that facet. So yes, concern from the public is likely in terms of the immediate slides that you saw at the very beginning of the deck is likely to drop off in terms of a top priority. That doesn't mean we can't still meet the current needs or the evolving needs of the public, but still maintain a focus on how we address climate change long term, if that makes sense.
Okay, this may be a tongue-in-cheek question, but somebody's written, when talking of government interventions, these seem to favour a command and control approach to freedoms, as they have done under COVID-19, where our freedom of movement was restricted. If the three messages were not, save the NHS, protect lives, stay at home, but instead were, I love this, don't fly, don't buy, and don't lie. And I can't imagine any government doing this, but what do you think if we went for that message on don't fly, don't buy, don't lie? This is calling out people who are making greenwashing claims or who are pretending to protect the environment but actually continue to pour out carbon. Well, so here's my view is that's going to be pretty difficult. I don't know if it's a tongue-in-cheek question, but it's I don't know. What's your take, Liz?
Point taken. I think one of the challenges here when it talks about limiting personal freedoms, here's where it gets really quite contentious for a lot of people that are actively engaged in the space, because there is ecofascism as a massive concern. You know, these are the people that were saying COVID-19 silver lining and suggesting that Mother Nature was, you know, this is her kind of payback, basically, in terms of how we treated her. That's something 100% that government, industry, and just experts and activists that we spoke to themselves are really, really keen to distance themselves from. So when we're talking about messaging, it's very difficult. How do you have clear and tangible messaging, and how do you engage in levers that aren't seen to directly limit personal freedom? So that's a really challenging area to navigate. But as we've mentioned before, with the congestion charge and the plastic bag tax, if it's done in the right way, if it's done on an incremental level, you can get widespread sweeping support.
Yeah, I mean, my view has been that the public has given government some latent permission to do things that are seen to be efficacious, i.e. to work, but also are seen as fair. And that is the congestion charge, where the majority of Londoners were opposed. Ken Livingstone did it anyway, but he had made sure it could work by providing enough public transport before doing it. So that is an interesting example. And certainly, as we know, as we've discussed previously, Jess, if we'd had a referendum on a congestion charge in London, we still wouldn't have one, in the same way that Stockholm and Manchester had a referendum and voted against it. There's another question which you may know the answer to, but I don't, which is from Andy, I think from Andy Fellon. Is there any evidence that green or ethical investment is anyway, because of climate change, is now starting to outperform investment in carbon-intensive activity? And I don't know the answer, so I may have to go and look it up for him, but you might.
There was suggestion of that in the US last I saw. UK specifically, I would need to get back to him on that because I'm not quite sure. But definitely there was a suggestion in the US that renewable energies were outperforming fossil fuels investments. But I'll need to look at that more closely and get back to him.
Okay, and we've got questions from Sarah Wilkins at the Great Fly Green Alliance about whether green travel is becoming a real trend. I mean, I think there's early signs, but in the past we've seen a lot of people. We're back into one of those classic say-do scenarios where loads of people used to tell us they were very keen on carbon offsetting their flights. Loads of people tell us they're worried about the impact of air travel, but then when you ask them, as you showed us in that presentation, you know, what are you planning to do in the future? And of course it's, well, I'm planning to fly. So, and they're not actually paying, a tiny fraction of people who fly pay for carbon offsetting. What you know, do we think that we might be making more progress in that area, Jess?
It's a challenging one. If we look at what's happening in China right now, in anticipation that maybe perhaps will follow suit, there has been an uptake in flying, but it's at about 25%, I believe, of what it was a year ago. And so it is likely that people perhaps will return eventually to similar behaviors. In terms of paying more for carbon offsetting, we really see quite frequently with the work that we do here that people, again, this goes back to the responsibility, they don't feel like the responsibility should be on the public themselves, the consumers themselves. So that if the responsibility is on them to pay extra for that, that's another ask that is very, very challenging. So willingness to pay generally is quite low for people in terms of what they're willing to pay extra for. Even when it comes to green packaging, let alone carbon offsetting their footprint. So it's less about what can the consumer pay to actually do in terms of, if you give them two options of equal pricing, what will they choose? Well, you know, so it's an area that we'll continue to watch and stuff, but there's nothing to my knowledge that suggests that this is a massive area for growth. But Sarah, perhaps, you know, maybe I'll need to touch base with you and you can enlighten me a little bit further.
I'd just like to say now, I think we're drawing to a close. The hour's nearly over. So thank you so much to Jessica and all of her colleagues who've pulled that together. I hope you found that some food for thought. This is never let a good crisis go to waste. So COVID-19 is an opportunity to relook at how we approach some of these colossal problems like climate change. COVID-19 has shown us how quickly humanity can act when a clear and present danger is visible to it. And of course, as we all know on this call, the problem with climate change is it's just as clear and present, but it's rather more slow acting. Our next seminar in this series is on the 23rd of June, and we'll send you details. And it's looking at financially polarised Britain and our experiences during lockdown and what it's meaning for people's finances, based on some in-depth work that we do for a large number of the banks in Britain using the FRS study, which some of you will know. But thanks again to Jess. Thank you for all of you for joining. Do send in your questions. Contact details have been up here in front of you if you have any more queries. And we will keep working in the green economy team here on those aspects and easy wins and places where business and government can easily make a difference and take consumers with them. But thank you so much for your time, and see you next time. Thank you.